Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, putting a wrap on the huge Oregon-Stanford game last night that could go a long way in deciding the Pac-12 North. And in the case of Stanford now, a possible berth in the college football playoff with much more work to do for the Stanford Cardinal. But they've cleared three significant hurdles on their way here in 2018. Of course, the Cardinal won it in dramatic fashion, 38-31 in overtime. First for the Ducks. Justin Herbert faced a big stage and a big opponent for the first time in his career, and he showed why he will most likely be a top 10 pick in the NFL draft next year. 25 of 27 in regulation. He was on target, and he was cool and calm and delivered the football and made all the throws. In overtime, 1 for 6. The Stanford coverage tightened up, and obviously the field at the 25-yard line shrinks in overtime. Okay, Oregon has also found its number one running back in C.J. Verdell. He ran for 115 yards and 20 carries and statistically outplayed Bryce Love. Jalen Jelks, Troy Dye, Justin Hollins, and the rest of that Oregon defense can be stout at times. They can be explosive. They can dominate a game. They did against Stanford in the first half, led by defensive coordinator Jim Leavitt. It was a talking point for us throughout the offseason what Jim Leavitt has meant and will mean to this Oregon defense with the number of playmakers they have on that side of the ball. What I did not like seeing at the time, and then it was backed up on social media, it was my perception watching the Ducks leave the field at halftime leading 24-7. They thought the game was won, waving towels, jumping around, celebrating. And I thought, this is not necessarily the sign that I want to see out of a team that knows that it has a lot of work to do. This game was not 48-0 at halftime. It was 24-7. It was a well-played first half. You should feel good about where you stand and confident that you can come out in the second half and close the deal. They looked like they had mailed it in at that point and assumed victory. Obviously, they collapsed, and there were a number of mistakes made in the second half. The one that's going to get magnified, the one that eventually cost them the game, was the Verdell fumble. With just about 45 seconds left in the game, they were at the Stanford 40-yard line. So the Ducks are running out the clock. Verdell was very close to a first down. If he runs for the first down, the game's over. They can kneel down after that. Okay, so Mario Cristobal basically faced his first difficult situation and first difficult decision as Oregon head coach. Of course, the first three opponents were cream puffs, and he got out to a big lead in this one. And then the game shrank on him. So he had two decisions to make. Do I risk the fumble, go for the first down? And this is what he did. Obviously, the chances of fumbling there are minuscule. Running backs fumble 3 or 4 or 5 times in the span of 200 and 300 carries, so it happens very infrequently for the average running back. But it happened here. The other choice for Cristobal was to punt the football, leave Stanford with basically no time left on the clock, meaning they could have knelt down before the fumble, wasted some time, kicked the ball away to Stanford. Stanford would have had to drive just for a field goal to tie the game, which they eventually did. They would have had the length of the field to drive, let's say from the 15-yard line, average punt, average type return, or fair catch around the 10 or 15-yard line, as Oregon had excellent field position. They were at the Stanford 40 at this point, so they kick it, let's say, inside the 10 or 15-yard line. Oregon has to drive it, or Stanford has to drive it from their 10 or 15 all the way to give Jet Toner a legitimate shot. They have to drive to the 35 of Oregon. So they've got to drive it about 50, 55 yards in 40-some seconds. They could have made that decision. It would have been extremely difficult with no timeouts. All right, so he had his first decision to make. He played the percentages in his favor in which he thought could be done, because you can completely ice the game, end the game with a first down. And Verdell was that close, but he fumbled. All right. KJ Costello on the Stanford side played an extremely good game. I think it was his best effort that I've seen in a critical situation against a good team, and he made the plays, of course, in the second half. A very tight 19 for 26, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, 327 yards as he passed for big plays in the second half. J.J. Arcega-Whiteside has emerged as a huge playmaker on this team. He is one of the country's best in converting big plays downfield. 7 touchdowns on the season after 2 in the Oregon game, 4 catches for 84 yards. Colby Parkinson made that volleyball catch. If you really watch the reception, it was pretty magnificent in overtime as the ball was underthrown and behind him, and he tapped it. He elevated his hand above the helmet of the defensive player and batted the ball back to himself. Really a remarkable catch by Parkinson for the touchdown in overtime. What impressed me was once Oregon gained a first down in overtime pretty easily, got the ball inside the 10-yard line pretty quickly with a first down pass, then Stanford was locked on those receivers. If you look at the 4 plays thrown into the end zone, Justin Herbert, who had completed 25 of 27 passes in regulation, looked at that field 4 times. And again, the field shrinks. You only have 10 yards to work with plus the end zone, but still, you see it time and time again. Obviously, teams score inside the 10-yard line throwing the football, and you've got an future NFL quarterback in the pocket, and he's not able to do anything on 4 consecutive throws. Tight coverage. He didn't make bad throws. He was trying to throw the ball into tight windows because that was his only option at that point. Excellent job by the Cardinal secondary on the final 4 plays of the game to hold Herbert and Oregon out of the end zone. Stanford was dominated in terms of number of plays run, yardage throughout the game until very late, in which they made their miraculous flurry. There was a controversy in this game in which, at this point, Oregon led 24-7. They were driving. Jalen Redd hit the pylon with his left foot, and he stayed in bounds on what would have been a 16-yard touchdown run. It was ruled out of the end zone and it given back to the Oregon Ducks at the 20-yard line. There was a fumble, returned all the way for a touchdown. Joey Alfieri ran it all the way back for a touchdown. So instead of going up at that point 31-7, it's a 24-14 game. So it goes from a 24-point lead to a 10-point lead, 14-point swing on the 80-yard fumble return. So that set up the conclusion and the Stanford comeback. All right, let's set up the Pac-12 North Division Championship race. The Cardinal 4-0. They've cleared 3 decent-sized or big hurdles in defeating San Diego State, a team that they lost to last year. USC, of course, at home, and then this huge one at Autzen Stadium against Oregon. 4-0. Of course, next week's game does not factor into the division race, but it's a huge one for Stanford's college football playoff chances at Notre Dame, the 8th-ranked team in the country. The big trifecta here is, of course, Stanford, Oregon, and Washington, so that's what we're going to focus on. For Stanford, they go to Washington. Having cleared the Oregon hurdle, they travel to Washington on November 3rd. For Oregon, now 3-1, 0-1 in the Pac-12. Now they've got a hill to climb. Little margin for error. They have the game against Washington on October 13th. That one's at home. So if the Ducks could beat Washington and then hope that Washington beats Stanford, they create a 3-way tie. All right, and looking at other games they could factor into the race. In addition, for Washington, of course, they've got to play these 2. They also travel to Cal and go to Washington State in November, of course, the final game of the season, the Apple Cup rivalry with the Cougars. And they have dominated this series in recent years, but the Cougars, a pretty capable football team again this year, based on their level of play against USC, even though they lost that game at the Coliseum. Okay, for Stanford, at Arizona State, at Cal, in addition to the game with Washington. At Arizona State, we see how well the Sun Devils have played this early season despite 2 losses, and Stanford goes to an undefeated Cal team later as well. For Oregon, they've got a slew of difficult games coming up, so they drop this one. They've got the mountain to climb. They're not in the driver's seat. They're behind the 8 ball at this point. They've got to go to Cal. They've got to go to Washington State. Maybe Arizona with Khalil Tate and Kevin Sumlin get their act together. Later in the season, the Ducks have to travel to Arizona, and they've got a November trip that's always difficult going to Utah. So that's what the challenge that's facing the Ducks right there. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, setting you up for Week 5 and wrapping up Week 4. Stanford, Oregon, that's the Pac-12 look. Right now, as it stands, I picked Washington to win it over Utah in the Pac-12 championship game preseason. I will stay with that pick. Of course, check out the helmets. If you have yet to hear about the helmet challenge, choose the 2 helmets that you would like to see me purchase. 2 helmets that we don't currently have back there, and I will do so on October 1st. We're running this challenge until October 1st. And of course, subscribe to the newsletter, The Voice of College Football. Simply send your email address to MarkRogersTV@gmail.com, and we'll put you on the mailing list for The Voice of College Football, which is released every Monday right here at Mark Rogers TV.